Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching Justinian Part 12, Caesar I Was and Am Justinian by Extra History. This is the last episode in Extra History's series on Justinian. Now last week we saw as Justinian tried to put the pieces of his empire back together. We saw as he dealt with the aftermath of a terrible plague, had to respond to both incursions to the east and the west, and probably most emotionally damaging, the death of his wife Theodora, who has been one of the main characters of this series. The series is named Justinian and Theodora. In this episode, Justinian is alone, and we'll get to see the last years of his reign. How did he close his time as emperor out? I guess we'll see. Now, before we get into this one, I'd appreciate it if you guys would leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. Now, with all of that out of the way, let's jump right into this reaction.
Our time with Justinian is nearly at an end. His conquest of Rome lost, his people decimated by plague.
Ugh.
The last man to dream of a reunited Rome has seen that dream slip through his fingers. But Justinian was never idle, even as he crossed his 65th year, and he was never one to give up on that dream. And though it would never seem as natural or as inevitable as it must have in the 530s, to the mind of Justinian, the thing that had once seemed his glorious destiny was still in the 550s his responsibility. And so, where...
Yeah, and it's not like he lost everything that he gained, right? He held on to some of that territory, though in the long term, the Roman Empire would lose all that territory. And a lot of his achievements remained, A lot of Justinian's achievements would very much outlast his time as emperor. They would be influential for tens, if not hundreds of years to follow. So though, we sort of saw everything fall apart, and he's lost a lot of the territory, the idea of a unified Roman Empire will essentially die along with him. Maybe not the idea, but the potential reality of it. Though, was it ever actually real under Justinian? Maybe not. But that does go with him. But a lot of the things he created, he built, he reformed, they will survive. So, yeah, an ambitious guy who didn't certainly achieve everything he wanted, but he did achieve a lot. And, like they said, he would never give up. He would keep working into his later years as emperor.
luck, brilliance, and splendor once served, labor, persistence, and time would now be his tools. With monumental effort, an empire near ruin was brought back to a functioning and even somewhat prosperous state. With renewed national fortunes came that lifeblood of armies, money. With the cash in hand to once again pay soldiers and equip troops, Justinian prepared to deal with the threats that had assailed the empire from all sides. And so we come to one of the most inscrutable parts of the reign of Justinian, the Last Company, the final group of men that he would choose to execute his will and restore the empire. For he chose a group of men who seemed like impossible candidates. They were ancient men, the last of a generation. He picked the Septarian Basus to retake Lazica, though he had largely been at fault for re-losing Rome. He chose Scholasticus, a court eunuch without any experience in the field, to command forays against the Slavs to the north, and to retake Italy. He picked the aging eunuch Narses, the same Narses who had bribed the Demes for Justinian during Nika, and yes, the very same guy who may have doomed the first Italian campaign by disputing Belisarius' commands.
Yeah, though, once again, and we saw this in prior episodes, it was unclear to what extent Narses was acting on behalf of Justinian, or what extent he was following Justinian's orders, or to what extent he was acting independently. That, I think Justinian was sort of unhappy with how things ended up, but it's unclear to me whether he truly sent Narses to be the nuisance he was, or if Narses decided to do that on his own.
It was a strange bunch to put in charge of an army, and yet in Lazica they won. They took Petra and at last made a peace with Persia that recognized Lazica as part of the Roman sphere. And in the Balkans they won. It may have taken some diplomatic wizardry from Justinian, but they won. And in Italy? In Italy, Narses did what Belisarius could never do.
Damn.
He finally kicked the Ostrogoths out of Italy entirely. Sure, he had 20,000 men at his disposal
Well,
and
there
a
you
full
go.
purse to work with, but with these resources, he was at last able to pin the Ostrogoths down in open battle, and truly, conclusively beat them in the field.
Well, I'm sure Rome will hold on to Italy forever. Right? That's where we're heading, right? I mean, like I said, even the accomplishments that Justinian had, some would last a long time, others would not.
In Italy, they finally won. Heck, while Narses was out in Italy, Justinian even received a letter from Hispania requesting his help, and sent 2,000 men under the command of the octogenarian bureaucrat Liberius, who promptly took over half the country and set up the province of Spania. If nothing else, Justinian's one great talent was somehow, even when all odds seemed against it, knowing exactly the right person to pick for a job. And that talent hadn't failed him, even when so much else had. But nothing is ever quite done. A wave of natural disasters hit the empire, and then the plague returned. While it didn't quite bring the empire to its knees the way the first wave did, it did create an opening for the Bulgars to sweep out of the north and raid the empire again. A contingent of them even came within 100 kilometers of Constantinople. With no other armies nearby, Justinian called on Belisarius.
There you go. And by the way, you want to keep an eye on some of the worst enemies of the Eastern Roman Empire, or the Roman Empire after the fall of the West, the Bulgars. If you look at the Byzantine Empire, as you might call it, or the Eastern Roman Empire from the fall of the West until it fell, the Bulgars were really one of their sort of longest standing enemies and rivals. They would never eclipse the influence of the Byzantines, but the Bulgars would challenge them several times, and sometimes pretty effectively.
One last time.
At this point, we're still kind of early in that process, but give them a couple hundred years, and the Bulgars will, form their own state empire, frankly, their own very powerful state that will truly challenge the Byzantines. But even at this point, they are definitely threatening at the very least.
The general, who had long since put down his arms, gathered together a force of retired soldiers, guardsmen, and volunteers from the Demes for one last service to the empire. And here he did what Belisarius does. He set far more campfires than he had men, and as the battle began, he had his main force make as much noise as possible while
He was always a tricky guy. We know that about Belisarius. He shares that with some, but not all, of the greatest generals of history. Some of your great generals were a little more straightforward, but others, like Julius Caesar, who is relevant to all of this, or Hannibal, these were also very tricky guys. They would use whatever tools they had to try and fool, manipulate, play with their enemies' minds. And Belisarius, though, he was also a great general in sort of straight-up combat, he definitely falls into that tradition of, all right, you want to trick your enemy as much as possible. And, if you can win a battle with the least amount of death and the least amount of fighting, that's the way to go for someone like a Belisarius.
he secreted away a part of his army for an ambush. And when the Bulgar forces attacked, they thought themselves outnumbered and surrounded as the ambush force poured fire from one side, and they heard the great din from the other. And so they fled. But that would...
And plus, that's an especially effective strategy for a general who seemed to always not have enough men. That is one of the stories of Belisarius' career, is that sometimes he was well supplied and had a lot of manpower, but oftentimes he was outnumbered by his enemies. He didn't have many resources to draw on. He was scrounging for supplies. So for a general in that position, being scrappy and tricky, those are good traits to have.
be the last service for Belisarius. And one by one, the chapter closed on all of our players. Tribonian had died in 542, Theodora in 548, John the Cappadocian fades out of the historical records sometime in the 550s. In 554, mortality makes even our historian Procopius put down his pen. And Belisarius? He himself passed in 565. Almost all of the minor players, those who have just had a bit part on Justinian's stage, they too are dead. Justinian is alone.
There's actually a story about Belisarius in his later years that, though probably isn't true, is, maybe worth discussing. And there's a famous painting that I'll show you guys in regards to that topic. So this painting is titled Belisarius Begging for Alms. It was debuted in 1781 by Jacques-Louis David, a very famous French painter. This was actually one of his sort of early popular paintings. It's sort of in this type of neoclassical, very dramatic style that would become popular in the late 18th century, especially with the later years of the Ancien regime into the French Revolution. A lot of these types of paintings were used as allegories for, contemporary politics. But anyway, that's sort of not the point. This is a painting that shows an old, blind Belisarius begging for money. And this is related to a story which some believed at the time, some may still believe now, but we think is false, that Belisarius was blinded even after all of his service, because, perhaps Justinian was suspicious of him, or Belisarius planned to betray him, or whatever. The story is that Belisarius was blinded and reduced to the status of a beggar. Now, we don't think this story is true. I think we basically know it isn't true. We have evidence that Belisarius was very well off towards the end of his life, but you can imagine why it's sort of a gripping narrative. This man who was so loyal to his empire was, not rewarded, was punished for his service, and was reduced to this. A narrative that was popular around that time, around 1781, late 1700s, in Ancien regime France, for obvious reasons. I don't know when this narrative emerged. I know it was already something that people believed, but I just thought I'd show it in association with this painting, because it's sort of a pretty famous depiction from Jacques-Louis David, who did a lot of sort of similar style paintings. A lot of these neoclassical style French painters of the era, they loved to paint these scenes of antiquity. And of course, a lot of the philosophers, the writers of this era, loved to write about ancient Greece and Rome, and they all loved to relate it back to their current era. But anyway, that is a story, a false story about what happened with Belisarius that I thought it was interesting to share. Anyway, back to Justinian, all alone, everyone around him dead, unfortunately.
The only one to outlive them all would be Narses, who would make it to the grand old age of 95.
Wow.
But he was out there in Italy, reorganizing...
God damn, that's old for now, but that's especially old for then. Although I will say, whenever you hear people saying things like, oh, in this time period, the average age was 30 or whatever, those are always misleading, because child mortality was always such a factor throughout history. You'll have a lot of kids, and most of them might die. That really brings your average age down, and that gives the false impression that throughout history people were living to like 25 and then dropping dead. And I don't know what the average age of this era was, but the average age usually isn't as low as you might imagine. If you make it past childhood, most people would live well into adulthood through a lot of times in history. Just a little tidbit there on, average age of death that is often a little misleading to people.
The province. A generation of greatness had passed. Justinian would spend his last years trying to consolidate what he'd achieved, and continuing his ill-fated attempts to reconcile the Christian church. But the days of glory and of boundless empire were at an end. In 565, after one of the longest reigns of any emperor in Roman history, and just a few months after Belisarius, he too died.
Yeah, so we talked about that story about Belisarius, but in reality, the two died pretty close to the same time. I think Belisarius died probably in his nice estate. He was fine, and the two died around the same time. And yeah, Justinian, he accomplished so much, and he was also one of the longest-serving Roman emperors of all time. He's got quite the sheet of accomplishments, serving so long, managing... Of course, he had the Nika revolt early in his reign, but he largely managed to avoid sort of civil strife, civil war, accomplishing all that he did, his legal code, the Hagia Sophia, reconquering a lot of this lost territory, even though it didn't work out in the long term. I mean, he had so many accomplishments to his name. Like I've said before, some of them really did have an impact in the long term. Some of them didn't really work out, like reconquering a lot of that territory, or his attempts to heal the divide within Christianity. Though that, I think, was an impossible task. That was never going to happen. But that was something that he attempted, and it didn't work out. But, truly an impressive figure of Roman history, whether you think that long-term his reign was, sort of a positive long-term, you think it set the empire up well, or you think that maybe he used his resources a little too willingly, he didn't set the empire up for the long term. Whatever you think, certainly a monumental emperor.
It's almost impossible not to wonder what his last thoughts were. Did he see the success of his conquests, or their cost? Did he die a man disappointed at failure to achieve his dream, to see a reunited Rome and a reunited church? Or did he look out at the Hagia Sophia one last time and think about how much he'd grown the empire, how he'd rationalized the laws, brought Rome back into the fold, and seen the empire through the plague without being torn apart by civil war? We'll never know. To this day, Justinian remains one of the great what-ifs of history. What if the plague hadn't struck? What if the Ostrogoths had capitulated one of those dozen times they were just about to? What if the Persians had been led by somebody less competent, or just been a little slower to attack?
Yeah, it is also pretty remarkable that at the same time, you have these two great rivals, the Romans and the Persians, and at the same time, they're led by these very impressive figures who have a lot of things in common. We talked about this in the episode on Khosrow. There was actually a lot of commonality between the two, and, there's a lot of parallels, and those parallels especially work because they were literally at the same time and interacting with each other, at least through intermediaries. So, there's a lot of what-ifs with Justinian. There's a lot of what-ifs with any historical figure. I think the biggest probably is the plague, right? How would things have gone differently if the plague hadn't happened? Because I've been known to criticize Justinian a bit, but, I think I try to be fair to him. I think at times he used his resources, a little too much. I think the sort of conquest of Western territories may have been doomed from the beginning, and I don't know if that set the empire up super well in the long term. But what I will say about Justinian is that, as you saw, he kept working until the end, and he did right the course a bit before he died. The empire's lowest point under him, well, who knows what the lowest point was. His lowest point might have been Nika, but probably during the plague. That was absolutely disastrous. And he righted the course from that point onwards. It wasn't that bad when he left, not to mention that wasn't his fault. It's known as Justinian's plague, but, it's a natural event, right? It's not like he caused that, and it was up to him to respond to it. So while, like I said, I have some critiques of Justinian, I think that he did try to put the empire back on the right path. In the long term, it did not end up on the right path, and not everything that happened was up to him, right? He can't control everything. He could only do what he could do.
What if Justinian's successors were as energetic and as capable as he had been?
Right, and that's the other thing with Justinian, is that, in order for his successors to keep up what he was doing, they probably would have had to have been as brilliant as him, and that just wasn't going to happen. There's just, maybe you get one more guy like that, but Justinian's a very rare kind of emperor. And really in any system of government, but especially in a system of monarchy, which this was, you don't get several rulers. You usually don't get several rulers in a row who are that brilliant. It's exceptionally rare. And that's what happened with Justinian. You had him, and then those who followed just couldn't live up to his image and his memory. They couldn't keep his accomplishments going, and so things sort of started declining. And, it's like you can't put that all on Justinian, Maybe he could have set the empire up better for the future, but he did try. The plague really wrecked things, and also, he didn't do super great securing an heir for the future. Other emperors have put more effort into it, but there's only so much you can control, right? You can't see into the future and predict the next, 5 emperors or whatever. You don't have control over that. And so at a certain point, even though he is the Emperor of Rome has so much power, it is out of his hands.
Any one of those things had turned out differently, perhaps we would consider him the greatest Roman emperor of all time. Perhaps the West...
I mean, if he had literally managed to reunify the Roman Empire for an extended period of time, yeah, he probably would be the greatest of all time.
would speak Greek and Latin and still see Constantinople as its capital. But none of those what-ifs took place, and within 100 years, almost everything he had gained would be lost.
Yikes.
Only the Hagia Sophia and his law code would truly endure.
And those are two pretty big things. I don't want to downplay that. I mean, we saw earlier in the series how influential the law code was. You know, worldwide, that has been the basis for a lot of law, you know? So that's extremely influential. And the Hagia Sophia, we talked about how, you know, people would come from far and wide to see the Hagia Sophia. It was a true architectural achievement. So those two things, which are, you know, probably what Justinian is remembered most for. I mean, he's remembered for his reconquest of Western territories, his law code, and the Hagia Sophia. Those might be the top three. The reconquest of Western territories did not last, but these two did, and these are both very impressive and impactful.
And for his conquests, for his vision of a Western empire, what did he sacrifice? Perhaps everything. He emptied the Byzantine treasury, taxed heavily, created thousands of miles of new borders to...
Right, and this is another what if, and this is where maybe you can levy some criticism against Justinian. Another what if Justinian hadn't devoted himself to reconquering former Roman territory and had instead devoted that energy to governing the territory he already had, right? Securing the Roman Empire for the future. Could things have gone differently then? You know, maybe so. He already put so much effort into all parts of governance, but he found himself stretched thin. What if he had, you know, left those Roman territories behind? Because, you know, in the long term, that's what would happen. They would be left behind. And he had turned that attention and those resources and that manpower elsewhere. Could things have gone differently? You know, I think maybe. You know, I think maybe the empire could have been in a better position for the future. I think in many ways, Justinian was a man sort of working against the tide of history. And it shows you how sort of powerful he was, that he did manage to swim against that tide a little. He temporarily took that territory back. But you can't swim against the tide of history for that long. You know, in the end, everything he did, was swept away as well. You know, his reconquest, the Byzantine Empire, the Roman Empire, the direction it was going. I just don't think it was going to end up as the unified Roman Empire once again. But hey, Justinian certainly made a try at it, which is impressive. But if he hadn't, what could have been different?
Guard for an empire reduced by plague and a soldiery reduced by his own wars. Italy would turn out to cost the empire more than it ever brought in, and North Africa would suffer a series of rebellions and convulsions due to his inability to pay the troops there. Would the Byzantines be so unprepared for the Muslim conquest 70 years later if Justinian hadn't squandered the empire?
I think that at that point you're extrapolating a bit too much. It's kind of 70 years later. That's kind of hard to tell. I don't know if I feel and that's why I'm sort of asking the questions. I don't know if I feel comfortable making any actual determinations, because at that point we're talking about counterfactuals, alternative history. You know, I don't know. I think even that question is a little, presumptive. I don't know if you can, it's going to be pretty hard, I think, to historically and factually tie Justinian's actions to the Roman Empire being unprepared for the rise of the caliphate. Now, tangentially, you can say, well, this led to this, and led to this, and led to this, and led to this, but there's a million factors each step. So I wouldn't necessarily frame it like that. I think it's just interesting to think about what could have been different. And plus, the Roman Empire, maybe things would have been different, but it was in a bad position when the caliphate arose for a bunch of different reasons. One of which is that the Romans and the Persians basically beat each other into the dirt, leaving them very vulnerable targets. So I don't know if you can tie that back to old Justinian. Maybe indirectly, but that's pretty tangential.
Resources on the ephemeral West? Would the empire have been bled dry by continuous Persian wars and further conflicts with barbarian tribes to the north if Justinian had just instead focused all that energy on settling these problems rather than his romantic dream of restoring?
That question is a little closer to home. It's less tangential, and I think once again you can't really make any determinations because it's not what happened. But I think maybe, perhaps, it's hard to say, but it seems to me there is a reality in which Justinian is able to secure his empire if he focuses on these problems a little closer to home. But that might not be true. We don't know.
Rome? But for all this, one can't help but respect the dream and the monumental efforts of the men of his age to make it come true. And in hearing about his work, one can't help but get a little lost in that dream, and imagine what the empire would have been if he'd achieved the success he came so close to. And so we leave Justinian and all those who stood by his side as a question and a cautionary tale, an enigma and a promise, a parable.
Sure, though, I just really don't think it was going to happen. I mean, the Roman Empire of Justinian, the Roman Empire had been in decline for hundreds of years, even prior to the fall of the West. It just doesn't seem realistic to me that that was going to be reversed and the empire would become unified again. You know, even if he had been more successful in his conquests, I still think they would have been lost over time, and the Byzantine Empire would have continued to shrink, maybe differently than it did, but, you know, similarly. So I just really, like I said, I think he was working against the tide of history, and I don't think it was gonna work in the long term.
To inspire us to dream, and a warning against being blinded by our own vision. And though the reign of Justinian is at an end, we continue to feel the echoes of these men and women centuries later, their triumphs and their failures. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.
True. Alrighty. That is our extra history series on Justinian and Theodora, though, of course, this one was just about him because she had already gone. Honestly, I think a lot of these episodes could have been called Justinian and Belisarius, or maybe just Belisarius. You know, he's such a big part of Justinian's career and legacy. He really, I mentioned this in another video, but you sometimes have these politician-general partnerships, you know, one of which is Augustus and Agrippa. They worked so well together. Justinian and Belisarius is another, I think, pretty similar one, though Justinian, I don't think, allowed Belisarius to reach his full potential because he was always so suspicious. Regardless, Belisarius was an absolutely essential partner to Justinian, and at times in this series sort of plays the role of main character. So maybe we can do Justinian, Belisarius, or Justinian, Theodora, and Belisarius. Add him in there. Anyway, yeah, I had a good time with this series. This was a long one. I believe this is, by quite a wide margin, the longest extra history series we've ever done. I don't know if they have others that are this long, but, you know, their typical series are like 5-6 episodes. This one was 12. Shows you, I guess, how much there is to say about old Justinian. But yeah, I had a good time with this. If you guys did, I'd appreciate it if you would leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon, which is down below. You know, we have a lot of videos that are related to this series. The series on Khosrow, our reactions to epic history videos on Belisarius. So if you're interested in this stuff, you should seek some of those out, because, you know, you'll see cameos from familiar characters in each of those. But anyway, I hope you guys are all having a good day today, and I'll see you all again next time. Goodbye.